Reading the Times for Wednesday, January 22nd. Reading the Times for Wednesday, January 22nd, 2020. Republicans block subpoenas for new evidence as impeachment trial begins. A divided Senate began the impeachment trial of President Trump on Tuesday in utter acrimony as Republicans blocked Democrats' efforts to subpoena witnesses and documents related to Ukraine, and moderate Republicans forced last-minute changes to rules that had been tailored to the president's wishes. Standing in the well of the Senate, the Democratic House impeachment managers urged senators to reject the proposed rules from the majority leader, Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, that would delay a debate over witnesses and documents until the middle of the trial, with no guarantee that they would ever be called. The McConnell rules seem to have been designed by President Trump and for President Trump, simply executed by Leader McConnell and Senate Republicans. Inside the chamber, Mr. Schumer forced votes on demanding documents and compelling testimony from 4 current and former Trump administration officials who were blocked from speaking with the House. John R. Bolton, the former White House National Security Advisor, Mick Mulvaney, the acting White House Chief of Staff, Robert B. Blair, an advisor to Mr. Mulvaney, and Michael Duffy, the White House budget official. Trump focuses on economy at Davos, seeking a counter to impeachment. As Mr. Trump and his family members darted among meetings in makeshift pavilions, they studiously avoided questions about the drama back home, where the Senate engaged in a fierce clash over the rules for putting the president on trial. Before my presidency began, the outlook for many economies was bleak. Although the economy's recovery after its plummet was central to President Barack Obama's legacy, Mr. Trump said that his administration had created a roaring geyser of opportunity and proclaimed that the American dream is back, bigger, better, and stronger than ever before. Addressing a global audience, Mr. Trump delivered what amounted to a version of his campaign speech, speaking little of international alliances while playing up America's dominance in the world. Mr. Trump's visit to Davos is his first foreign trip since Speaker Nancy Pelosi sent 2 articles of impeachment to the Senate, and the first since he authorized a drone strike that killed Major General Qasem Soleimani, Iran's most powerful security commander. Architect of CIA interrogation program testifies at Guantanamo Bay. Dr. Mitchell, a former contract psychologist for the CIA, expressed no regret or contrition, tearfully saying he did it for the American people at a time when President George W. Bush's administration feared a follow-on attack by airplane or nuclear bomb to the September 11th hijackings that killed 2,976 people. Dr. Mitchell described the decision to use waterboarding and other coercive physical pressure as born of a climate that feared Al-Qaeda was plotting a nuclear attack on the United States or plotting to crash another plane somewhere, and the gloves were off. Until that point, CIA and FBI agents were taking turns interrogating Mr. Zubada, who had stopped cooperating in a secret prison that has since been revealed to have been in Thailand. You folks have been saying untrue and malicious things about me and Dr. Jessen for years, Dr. Mitchell said, referring to John Bruce Jessen, another psychologist who worked with him to devise the interrogation system. The test a deadly coronavirus outbreak poses to China's leadership. It classified the virus as a Class B infectious disease, a category that includes diseases such as SARS, but the government, wary of letting fear run rampant, is also working meticulously to control the narrative about the virus by censoring news articles and social media posts. Now, even as the government works to isolate sick patients amid travel by millions of people making visits for the Lunar New Year holiday, There's concern that the party's long-held reluctance to divulge damaging news could hinder the effort to contain the virus. Mr. Hui's stepmother was never formally tested for the virus, and he was concerned that the Wuhan government was underreporting cases of the illness. A challenge for the trial: 100 senators who love to talk, sitting in silence. Every senator will have some trouble. We are not by nature silent, said Senator Roy Blunt, Republican of Missouri, and the chairman of the Senate Rules Committee. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat of Rhode Island, temporarily sat down in a Republican Senate's chair to chat with Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina. The oath of silence on pain of imprisonment while receiving articles of impeachment dates to 1798, when the Senate adopted impeachment rules for the trial of Senator William Blount of Tennessee, according to information provided by Senate Historical Office. Nobody likes him. Hillary Clinton risks a party split over Bernie Sanders. Mrs. Clinton, for her part, seized on it and said it was part of a pattern, noting that he had said in 2016 that Mrs. Clinton was unqualified to be president. Mr. Sanders apologized on Monday to Mr. Biden after a Sanders campaign surrogate wrote an opinion article accusing the former vice president of having a big corruption problem. Speaking to reporters on Tuesday in Washington, Mr. Sanders said, "Secretary Clinton is entitled to her point of view. My job today is to focus on the impeachment trial." When asked for his response to Mrs. Clinton's assertion that no one liked him, he joked, "On a good day, my wife likes me, so let's clear the air on that one." Mrs. Clinton tried to clarify her remarks on Tuesday evening. Many supporters pounced on Mrs. Clinton's remarks, arguing that she remained out of touch with the working-class Americans who backed Mr. Sanders. Big changes? Maybe not. Putin's plans keep Russia guessing. President Vladimir V. Putin announced constitutional changes last week that could create new avenues for him to rule Russia for the rest of his life. Yuri Y. Cheka, the powerful prosecutor general, abruptly left his post on Monday, only to resurface as Mr. Putin's new representative to Russia's Northern Caucasus region on Tuesday. The roster of ministers received new heads, including healthcare, sports, education, and economy, suggested that Mr. Putin wanted to show he was taking Russian domestic problems seriously, while not planning any shifts in foreign policy. Lebanon names new cabinet amid political and economic crisis. Lebanon announced the formation of a new cabinet on Tuesday, breaking a months-long deadlock with the nomination of 20 new government ministers who will have to address a perplexing mix of political and economic crisis. Many of the new ministers were little known beforehand or had backgrounds that did not clearly relate to the ministries they're supposed to lead. The new defense minister, for example, has no military experience. In comments to the news media on Wednesday, some of the new ministers asked the country to give them time to work and appealed for unity. UK promises stronger terrorism laws after knife attack by suspect. The British government said on Tuesday that it would toughen terrorism sentences and end early release for serious offenders, following through on promises made by Prime Minister Boris Yeltsin in November after a convicted terrorist who had been automatically released carried out an attack that killed 2 people near London Bridge. The attacker, Usman Khan, 28, was released in December 2018 after serving 8 years of a 16-year sentence for his involvement in a bomb plot. Began a knife attack while attending an event on prison rehabilitation at Fishmongers Hall, a central London conference venue. The senseless terror attack at Fishmongers Hall in November confronted us with some hard truths about how we deal with terrorism offenders, Homeland Security Priti Patel said. Iran admits firing 2 missiles at jet and says it's studying effect. The downing of Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 on January 8 came amid heightened tensions between Iran and the United States that included tit-for-tat military strikes, and after the killing of the top Iranian security commander, Major General Qasem Soleimani, in a United States drone attack at the Baghdad airport. Many have accused Iran of dragging its feet, a complaint likely to be bolstered by the suggestion on Tuesday that the plane's black boxes would be analyzed in Iran instead of being sent abroad. The Iranian Aviation Organization said it had been asked It had asked United States and French aviation authorities to provide the equipment needed to decode the data recorders on the Boeing 737 because it did not have necessary technology. Canada, too, has criticized Iran's level of cooperation, as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Iran should give the recorders to France for analysis. Ex-president of Interpol is sent to prison for bribery in China. 2 years later, Mr. Meng disappeared completely, abruptly, on a return visit to China, whose ruling Communist Party later disclosed that he was under investigation. On Tuesday, a court in Tianjin, a port city in northern China, found that Mr. Meng had taken bribes worth more than $2 million from 2005 to 2017, when he was rising in China's domestic security apparatus. Mr. Meng's wife, Grace Meng, has rejected the allegations against her husband and, unusual for the spouse of a senior Chinese official, sought protection abroad. She has stayed in France since her detention. Abandoned and forgotten, jailed academic writes of despair in Iran. Miss Moore Gilbert accused the Revolutionary Guards of playing an awful game with me. I'm taking psychiatric medications, but these 10 months I've spent here have gravely damaged my mental health. Miss Moore Gilbert wrote in a letter dated July 2019, "Everything else can wait for another day." The Australian authorities first confirmed Miss Moore Gilbert's detention nearly a year after her arrest, when it was revealed that a British-Australian blogger and her Australian boyfriend were also being held. In another letter that Miss Moore Gilbert wrote to her Iranian case manager, she stated her official and definitive rejection of your offer for me to work with the intelligence branch of the Revolutionary Guard. I can't bring back the dead. Sri Lanka leader ends search for war missing. Dashing the hopes of thousands of families desperate for word about loved ones who went missing during Sri Lanka's long, grisly civil war, and the country's new president has offered an unsparing rebuff to the request for closure. The missing are in fact dead, said the president Gotabaya Rajapaksas, and I can't bring back the dead. The government, eager to close a painful chapter in the country's history, plans to issue death certificates for the missing Sri Lankans, a number put at 24,000. The history of Sri Lanka's missing goes back further than the Civil War. Why these Australian fires are nothing like we've seen before. The Gospers Mountain Fire, which became Australia's largest mega blaze as it grew to link several separate fires, offers a sense of the scale of the country's most disastrous fire season ever. Australia has had deadlier fire seasons. The Black Saturday bushfires, which began on February 2009, which downed power lines, ignited blazes that were spread by 60-mile-an-hour winds, killed 173 people in Victoria. The top expert on greenhouse gas emissions in Australia's National Research Agency told NPR that the fires in Southeast Australia have produced as much carbon as an entire country emits from man-made sources in more than 8 months of the year. Australian coal company says bushfire smoke is slowing production. Australia's biggest mining company, BHP, announced on Tuesday that the coal output was down at one of its largest mines. The reduced air quality in New South Wales, the country's most populous state, has helped slow the company production of electricity-generating coal by 11% there. BHP said in a review of its mid-year financial results, even as the company investigates options to reduce its climate impact, he said, coal will remain a major part of its energy production mix. Earth's oldest asteroid impact found in Australia. Based on measurements of 39 zircon and monazite crystals, Dr. Erickson and his team calculated that the Yarrabubba impact occurred 2.229 billion years ago, with an uncertainty of 5 million years. Nature Communication 2020, the age of the Yarrabubba The age of the Yarrabubba impact structure happens to line up with the end of an ice age, which makes for a compelling coincidence. Mr. Erickson said, would an impact event like Yarrabubba be enough to terminate a glacial time in Earth's history? To help answer that question, the scientists modeled the effects of a roughly 4-mile wide impact object striking ice sheets of different thicknesses. Trump, the teenager. Climate showdown at Davos. Ms. Thunberg, for her part, largely repeated the warning she issued at the United Nations last year and for which she has drawn widespread global attention. Ms. Thunberg has always maintained that she has no interest in meeting Mr. Trump and suggested that he consult climate scientists if he wants to learn the facts. Though Mr. Trump barely mentioned climate change, he did commit the United States to a World Economic Forum initiative to plant 1 trillion new trees as a way to mitigate carbon dioxide emissions. Mining executives face homicide charges in Brazil dam disaster. Mr. Pinto Coelho said that the Brumadinho Dam had not been the only one at risk, and throughout the investigation, prosecutors advocated for action when they learned of other Vale sites deemed unstable. Pier Paolo Bottini, Mr. Schwartzman's lawyer, said there was no evidence the former Vale chief executive had been made aware of concerns about the dam in Brumadinho. The company said the causes of the dam bursting have not been conclusively ascertained. Vale had spent hundreds of millions of dollars in cleanup, reconstruction, and compensation efforts in Brumadinho. Glenn Greenwald charged with cybercrimes in Brazil. The news organization Mr. Greenwald co-founded, the Intercept Brazil, published articles last year based on leaked cell phone messages that raised questions about the integrity and the motives of key members of Brazil's justice system. Mr. Greenwald has been a part of a team that won some of the most important prizes in journalism, the George Polk Award and the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, for reporting on documents that described government surveillance. Mr. Greenwald first became widely known for his role in the release of classified national security documents leaked by the former National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden in 2013. What we know about the Wuhan coronavirus. On January 8th, the New York Times reported that the Chinese researchers had identified a new coronavirus as the pathogen behind a mysterious illness that had sickened 59 people in Wuhan, a city of 11 million people in central China. Animals are the most primary source of the outbreak, but it is not clear which animals. Dr. William Schaffner, professor of preventative medicine and infectious diseases at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, said that travelers to China should absolutely avoid live animal markets and keep their distance from any animals in rural areas. First patient with Wuhan coronavirus is identified in the U.S. Specimens from the patient that were sent into the CDC in Atlanta, and officials confirmed on Monday he was infected with the Wuhan coronavirus, also called 2019 nCoV. Health officials declined to identify the patient, but said he had a mild case of pneumonia, is doing well, and has been very cooperative. We're very comfortable with the patient in isolation and the patient is isolated and poses little risk to the staff or general public, said Chris Spitters, health officer at the Snohomish Health District, adding that the strict isolation practices were implemented in an abundance of caution. News of the first case of the virus in the United States surfaced as officials studied growing evidence that disease can be transmitted from person to person, although it is not clear how easily. The World Health Organization is meeting on Wednesday to decide whether to declare the outbreak an international public health emergency. Chinese city uses facial recognition to shame pajama wearers. Among their top targets, people wearing pajamas in public. On Monday, the Urban Management Department of Suzhou, a city of 6 million people in Anhui province, sparked outrage online when it published surveillance photos taken by street cameras of 7 residents wearing pajamas in public, along with parts of their names, government identification number, and location where their uncivilized behavior had taken place. Others believe public places are truly public, where there's no blame, no supervision, no public pressure. This has brought about a kind of complacence, undisciplined mindset, it concluded. UK police plan driving classes at airbase after fatal crash. The British police will offer free driver training to employees at an airbase that hosts a United States Air Force communication station, after 2 incidents threatened a repeat of a crash that killed a British teenager and prompted a months-long diplomatic tug-of-war between Britain and the United States. Last Friday, another car driving the wrong side of the road almost collided with another vehicle near the base. Even President Trump said after the August crash that driving on the left-hand side of the road in Britain could be problematic for people accustomed to driving on the right. The census begins where it has struggled before, remote, frozen Alaska. The Census Bureau estimated that the Native Americans and Alaska Natives living on reservations were undercounted by about 4.9% during the 2010 census, more than twice the rates of the next closest population group. The census hopes to avoid an undercount by using partners who can help lay the groundwork in minority communities, hiring people with knowledge of local neighborhoods to do the actual count, and producing videos in 59 languages that explain how to fill the census form out. Noting the estimated 4.9% undercount in the 2010 census, James Tucker, a Las Vegas attorney and vice chair on the National Advisory Committee to the Census Bureau, said the rate was likely twice as high. Barr once contradicted Trump's claim that abuse of power is not impeachable. In a 110-page brief on Monday, Mr. Trump's impeachment team, led by Pat A. Cipollone, the White House counsel and a former aide to Mr. Barr in the first Bush administration, and Mr. Trump's personal lawyer, Jay Sekulow, portrayed the article of impeachment claiming that Mr. Trump had abused his power in the Ukraine affair as unconstitutional because he was not accused of an ordinary crime. Under the framers' plan, the determination whether the president is making decisions based on improper motives or whether he is faithfully discharging his responsibilities is left to the people through the election process and the Congress through the impeachment process. The result of Mr. Barr's main argument in 2018 and the Trump team's theory in 2020 is identical. Both posited that facts were immaterial, both in a way that was convenient to counter the threat Trump faced at the moment. If Trump impeachment team's theory is correct, the Senate has no basis to subpoena documents or call witnesses. Trump trial day one roped off reporters and TV cameras run by the Senate. After less than 3 hours of live coverage on Tuesday, the network of Walter Cronkite cut away from the Senate impeachment trial of President Trump, yielding a daytime fare like Dr. Phil and Judge Judy. NBC had held out longer, but by 5 p.m., ABC was the last traditional broadcast network still breaking news mode. The Senate officials rejected repeated requests to allow outside cameras into the chamber to record the trial, meaning that what viewers see and hear will be dictated by cameras and microphones controlled by Senate staff members, rather than an independent news organization. Attentive viewers may have noticed a graphic in the upper left corner of the MSNBC screen, noting that the trial footage was provided by Capitol Hill Senate TV, the government, not a news outlet. Trump impeachment, a quill and ink process, enters the digital age. Viewed from one angle, the first day of the Senate trial of President Donald J. Trump was a plain affair. Still, the Senate trial of a sitting president accused of pressuring a foreign country to smear his political opponent is stunning TV sight. However basic the camera work. One of his handpicked congressional advocates, Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio, your ears may still be ringing from his defense of the president in the House, made the rounds on Fox News Tuesday. Why this Texas city is saying yes to refugees while the governor is saying no. In 2016, Texas withdrew from the federal refugee resettlement program in a dispute with the Obama administration over the state's refusal to accept Syrian refugees. Two nonprofit groups, Refugee Services of Texas and Catholic Charities of the Texas Panhandle, resettled and assisted nearly 7,000 refugees in Amarillo and nearby cities from 2007 through 2017. Nobody cares what color somebody is or where they came from. Nobody cares. Mr. Mboko, the Congolese refugee, has embraced his Texas identity, but said he was shocked and saddened that Mr. Abbott wanted to refuse more refugees. Iranian student turned back at the airport, sparking protests. An Iranian student was turned away from Boston's Logan International Airport on Monday, sparking protest over the latest in the growing number of cases of international students blocked from entering the United States amid heightened diplomatic tensions with Iran. People were texting me. There was a student at the airport. There's a student at the airport, she said. Members of the Iranian American community in Boston, including university students and professors, along with immigration rights advocates and lawyers, gathered to protest at the airport, chanting, "Students' dreams matter." The legal petition was granted at 9:27 p.m., according to federal courts. Trump considering an expansion of his 2017 travel ban. The Trump administration plans to introduce an updated version of the long-disputed travel ban enacted shortly after President Trump's inauguration in 2017. expanding the list to include countries the White House has suggested had fallen out of compliance with the United States security measures. While there are no new announcements at this time, Mr. Gridley said, common sense and national security both dictate that if a country wants to fully participate in U.S. immigration programs, they should also comply with all security and counterterrorism measures, because we do not want to import terrorism or any other national security threat into the United States. Mr. Trump's initial executive order, which closed the country's border to people from 7 predominantly Muslim countries, was announced when his administration was only days old, causing a nationwide outcry and prompting protests at several large airports. The efforts to tamp down on visitors from those countries with a travel ban coincided with efforts within the administration to lower the number of refugees admitted to the United States. The former journalist, who is Bernie Sanders' media critic. Burn Notice received attention Monday for having promoted a Guardian column by RTT Jan, a Sanders surrogate, that accused Joseph R. Biden Jr. of having a big corruption problem, started hours before Mr. Sanders disavowed the column. After Mr. Sanders and Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts tussled in last week's debate over whether Sanders had told Ms. Warren he did not believe a woman could defeat Mr. Trump, Mr. Sirota accused CNN of contriving the story, even though the two candidates themselves confirmed the disagreement on live television. Mr. Khanna called Mr. Sirota one of the 5 or so true believers, along with James Sanders and a few others. The nature of private media is to make money. Mr. Sanders has been critical of the media on his media platforms almost as long as he has been in the public eye. Grammy's chief calls her removal retaliation for exposing Boys Club. The Academy placed Ms. Dugan on administrative leave for what it said was a formal allegation of misconduct by a senior female member of the Recording Academy team. The allegation, according to Ms. Dugan's complaint, was made by a former assistant to Mr. Portnow, who has remained attached to Ms. Dugan until she hired her own aide. In an interview with the New York Times before Ms. Dugan's complaint was filed, Mr. Mason and Christine Albert, the Academy's board emeritus, said they were committed to changing the organization, but that Ms. Dugan had been moving too fast, had not taken the time to understand how the organization functioned, and disrespected the staff by not listening to their opinions. Ms. Dugan's complaint argues that the assistant's complaint was a mere pretext for dismissing Ms. Dugan after she reported problems at the Academy and challenged the close business ties between the organization and 2 law firms that perform bulk of its legal work, yielding millions of dollars of fees every year. Biden and Sanders trade criticism over honesty, Social Security, and guns. A day after former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. and Senator Bernie Sanders appeared to have broken a truce after weeks of tension, Mr. Biden released a video on Tuesday night suggesting the Sanders camp was engaging in dishonest attacks, and Mr. Sanders responded with a video of his own criticizing Mr. Biden over his Social Security record. In recent weeks, the Sanders campaign has indeed been intensely critical of Mr. Biden over his vote to authorize a war in Iraq, a record Mr. Biden has repeatedly mischaracterized. Over Mr. Biden's long record on Social Security, issuing at least one false attack, according to the fact-checking outlet PolitiFact, and over his reliance on high-dollar donors, with a prominent Sanders surrogate claiming in an op-ed article on Monday that Mr. Biden had a big corruption problem. Mr. Sanders' campaign circulated the article, and in a statement Tuesday night, Mr. Sanders' campaign manager, Faik Shakir, called the Biden spot the first negative ad of the 2020 Democratic primary. He had to let it be clear about why. He's trying to distort his decades-long record on proposing and voting for cuts to Social Security benefits for millions of people. Joe Biden is no defender of Social Security, and a negative ad won't help him outrun his record. Mr. Sanders is seeking to cut into Mr. Biden's base and oldest caucus goers in Iowa, seizing on an issue of great significance to them. Religious school choice case may yield a landmark Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court has ruled the states may include religious schools in publicly funded school choice programs, but a ruling that would essentially require it would be groundbreaking. The Supreme Court has ruled that states may include religious schools in publicly funded school choice programs, but a ruling that would essentially require it would be groundbreaking. If it's unconstitutional to exclude private religious schools from a program that provides aid for public schools, it's hard to see where the line is drawn and where the neutrality principle ends, said Kevin Wellner, the director of National Education Policy Center and a professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder School of Education. Several public education groups, such as the AASA, the School Superintendents Association, wrote that at play was a voucher scheme that shifts public funds away from the local public schools to the detriment of students who have no real choice but to remain. Civil liberties groups like the Americans United for the Separation of Church and State and American Civil Liberty Unions argued in a brief that a ruling against Montana will force taxpayers to fund religious indoctrination and discrimination in schools. Supreme Court will not rule quickly on Obamacare appeal. In December, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans agreed that a mandate was unconstitutional, but declined to rule on the fate of the remainder of the healthcare law, asking the lower court to reconsider the question in more detail. The Democratic states and the House, which intervened in the case in order to defend the healthcare law, asked the Supreme Court to immediately review the Fifth Circuit's ruling. The lower court's action, the lawyers wrote, have created doubt about the future of the entire Affordable Care Act, which in turn threatens adverse consequences for governments, individuals, doctors, hospitals, insurers, and other businesses. Speaker Nancy Pelosi expressed dismay with the Supreme Court's refusal to speed up consideration on whether to hear the case. More slayings at Parchman as Mississippi confronts prison crisis. Prison officials in Mississippi said on Tuesday that 2 inmates were beaten to death in the state penitentiary in Parchman, coming after a burst of violence across the state that left 5 inmates dead and underscored the troubles facing the correctional system the new government has called a catastrophe. Parchman, a maximum security prison notorious for its harsh conditions, has been on lockdown since gang-fueled spate of violence and disorder several weeks ago. Critics have urged federal officials to investigate conditions that they've condemned as unconstitutional and inhumane, and 29 inmates filed a lawsuit last week against state officials, casting the recent killings as the culmination of years of severe understaffing and neglect. In a statement, prison officials disclosed few details about the circumstances surrounding the most recent killings. We are investigating further. Separately, an inmate was found dead in his cell on Saturday night, officials said, in an apparent suicide. Brazil calls Glenn Greenwald's reporting a crime. Mr. Greenwald is best known for his role in the release of national security documents leaked by Edward Snowden, the former National Security Agency contractor, in 2013. The 95-page criminal complaint made public on Tuesday said Mr. Greenwald not only received and wrote about hacked messages, but actually played a clear role in facilitating the commission of a crime. For instance, a prosecutor said Mr. Greenwald communicated with hackers while they were monitoring private chats on a messaging app. Mr. Greenwald's article did what a free press is supposed to. They revealed a painful truth about those in power. Why Trump's threadbare legal argument will probably work. Let's dispense with one thing off the bat. President Trump's impeachment defense is, in addition to being riddled with false factual claims and misleading characterizations, legal claptrap. Since House Democrats did not charge the president with committing any specific crimes in abusing his power or obstructing Congress, which are the grounds for the 2 articles of impeachment that the House of Representatives adopted last month, Mr. Trump must skate, the reasoning goes. So why is Mr. Trump's argument almost certainly going to work? Because the Republican majority in the Senate, led by Mitch McConnell, knows that its own survival is tied to Mr. Trump and cares more about its grip on power than its fidelity to constitutional governance. How to defeat Trump and catch a frisbee. Democrats need to just keep repeating over and over one question. Why would an innocent man and a jury interested in the truth not want all the evidence out and all the witnesses to testify? Wouldn't you if you were innocent? Indeed, at moments like these, I always fall back on what I consider to be one of the most useful essays in political science. Democrats still need to come up with a compelling candidate against Mr. Trump. Democrats running in swing districts in 2018 also need to keep it simple. Focus on Trump's attempts to destroy Obamacare and coverage on pre-existing medical conditions. Let us all now weep for Donald Trump. The lawyers write if a process rigged against Trump, it's a strategy for him. He believes and he has said that whining is the way to get what you want. Timothy O'Brien, who wrote the Trump biography, Trump Nation, Recall that in 1980s, when Trump failed to get support that he wanted from Mayor Ed Koch for an enormous development in Manhattan, he threw himself a pity party, railing that the system and local government were conspiring against him. Trump simply fashioned himself as a beleaguered hero battling dark forces when he bought into the fledgling United States Football League and sought to make it competitive with the National Football League. As the conservative columnist Rich Lowry noted in August 2015 by Trump's own account, he's the baddest, smartest thing going, except if you ask him a challenging question, in which case he kicks and screams and demands to know how anyone can treat him so unfairly. Lowry crowned Trump the most fabulous whiner in all of American politics. The CNN anchor Chris Cuomo subsequently asked Trump about Lowry's words. How to convince a white realtor you're middle class. As one of my subjects, Charlotte, put it, black people have two faces, so you know how to present yourself in a white world, and you present yourself in a black world as yourself. There's a good reason to believe that public identity behaviors identified are an essential part of black middle class life as ever. In a 2019 survey by the Pew Research Center, black respondents were more likely than any other racial group to report that they had felt people were suspicious of them, that people acted as though they were not smart, they were treated unfairly in hiring, pay, or promotion, and they had been unfairly stopped by the police. It's worth mentioning that while my research focuses on middle-class black people, there's no doubt that black people of lower socioeconomic status who can't tap into these public identities have daily encounters that are even more unfair and demoralizing. How Amazon, Geico, and Walmart fund propaganda. Not even Lenin could have imagined Vladimir Putin's success in getting some of the largest Western companies to subsidize his disinformation efforts by advertising on his government-run news websites. Geico is hardly alone in financing propaganda through what is called programmatic advertising, ads that are placed automatically by algorithms without judgment based on content or journalistic standards of the websites. The problem is that with programmatic advertising, brands can target the kind of audience they want to reach online, rather than specifying, as they once did, on which websites their ads should appear. Debate over the rules for Trump's trial. Because Chief Justice John Roberts has Supreme Court responsibilities in the morning and cannot begin his impeachment duties until 1 p.m., Mitch McConnell's compressed trial schedule would result in a trial that would go with breaks well beyond 1 a.m. Doesn't this amount to forced sleep deprivation of the jurors, not to mention the Chief Justice? What's more, how can jurors be expected to process information efficiently and think rationally over the span of 12 hours extended beyond bedtime? Or is rational no longer considered necessary in trials? I mean, really, a trial held in the middle of the night? Who does that? Oh yes, people in a dystopian nightmare. Mitch McConnell and other Republican senators argue that the Senate should not allow new witnesses or documents in the impeachment trial of President Trump, because the House should have gone to the court to enforce its subpoenas. Too late now, or is it? In any trial, if the defendant employed the spouse of a judge or juror, wouldn't that be a constitutional basis for recusal of the judge or dismissal of the juror? Is not the Secretary of Transportation the wife of one of the key jurors, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, and employed by the defendant, the President of the United States, serving at his pleasure? If Alan Dershowitz is, as he says, acting in defense of the Constitution, then he is doing so at the expense of democracy. Listening Well, a love story, and other tales. A controversy over Israel and Zionism at New York private school. I am the high school history teacher whom the rabbis characterize as teaching hateful, even anti-Semitic views in their essay attacking anti-Zionist educators. On January 9th, I was removed from my position at Philston School amid allegations driven by conservative media outlets that my criticism of Zionism and my trans identity made me unfit to teach. Teachers should not have to appear neutral when teaching about grave injustice and violence. How to fix $6.1 billion budget hole, attack healthcare spending. All told, Medicaid, a state and a federal program that provides health care to low-income residents, accounted for a third of the state's projected $6.1 billion budget gap. At the same time, Mr. Cuomo would like to reduce the state's film credit for productions in the state to 25% from 30% and require more than $1 million to be spent in the city or its suburbs to qualify. The Working Families Party, a progressive political party, said the state was not lacking for mega millionaires who can afford to invest more in our community's well-being. Mr. Mujica, the governor's budget director, said that although budget officials do not foresee an economic downturn in the next year, the cap on federal deductions that President Trump approved in 2017 was continuing to hurt wealthy high-tax states like New York, which has driven high-income residents to leave the state, hurting the state's coffers. In crowded New York City, should newcomers go back to Iowa? You go back to Ohio. New York belongs to the people who are here and made New York City what it is. His comment struck at a broader anxiety across all 5 boroughs about gentrification and affordability, and whether those forces have homogenized the city for the worse. In Mr. Adams' statement on Tuesday, he encouraged all New Yorkers to respect each other and seek to alleviate, not exacerbate, the problems we face. But where exactly do these New Yorkers come from? Many are moving here from California and Florida, and not exactly the cornfields of Iowa. According to a 2018 report by StreetEasy, the real estate website, Mr. Stringer criticized the city's recent rezoning plans, which invite an influx of new development, saying they took place in diverse neighborhoods like Inwood and East New York, and not in wealthier neighborhoods like Park Slope and the Upper East Side. Girl, 11, dies in unexplained fire in Brooklyn. Others who knew her described her as a beautiful girl, but on Monday night, after a fire broke out in her Brooklyn home, Sher was found unconscious inside the apartment, rushed to a nearby hospital where she was pronounced dead. The police said, as of Tuesday afternoon, fire marshals were still investigating the cause of the fire in the Midwood area of Brooklyn, officials said. Mysterious fire and death of The authorities were also investigating a fire in Queens, where a man who has not been identified was found dead in a building under construction, and a blaze in the Bronx, in which the 85-year-old man was found inside his apartment in the Co-op City neighborhood around 2:45 a.m. Separately, hundreds of firefighters spent hours working to control a five-alarm fire in Staten Island on Monday, which eventually spread through 6 buildings, according to the fire department. Sheldon Silver's corruption conviction is partly overturned. Despite its vacating of Mr. Silver's convictions in a scheme involving Dr. Taub, the panel noted that there was overwhelming evidence that Silver knowingly accepted referrals in exchange for action. Prosecutors had alleged that Mr. Silver arranged for New York State Department of Health to award Dr. Taub grants totaling $500,000 in return for Dr. Taub's agreeing to refer patients with potentially lucrative legal claims to a law firm, Whites and Luxembourg, which gave part of its fees to Mr. Silver. From the moment Dr. Taub approached Silver about research funding, Silver knew he had the power over something of great value to Taub, Judge Wesley wrote. My AirPods fell through a subway grate. Here's how I got them back. Apple AirPod review. Perfect AirPods, but they don't... Oh my gosh. Thousands of New Yorkers lose tech on the subway tracks or through a subway grate. An MTA spokeswoman, Meredith Daniels, would tell me later, my AirPod fell through an MTA grate. Mr. Garfield told me he would not have tried to retrieve his AirPod if it had fallen through a grate. Weinstein's lawyers say accusers bragged about sex with him. Harvey Weinstein's dark days. Prosecutors have signaled that they intend to portray Mr. Weinstein as a powerful producer who used his influence to force and manipulate women into having sex with him. The evidence will show the complaining witnesses sent dozens and dozens of loving emails to Harvey Weinstein, Mr. Sharona said, adding one woman gave Mr. Weinstein her new phone number. Another sent an email saying she wanted the producer to meet her mother. Last week, Mr. Weinstein's lawyers had argued to the court that the producer could not get a fair trial in New York City because of an unprecedented media spectacle that included reporters and camera crew filling courthouse hallways and protests against Mr. Weinstein taking place on the street outside. Boeing pushes back 737 MAX return again. The announcement reflects Boeing's new appreciation for the challenges facing the company in an effort to persuade regulators that the MAX is ready to fly. The three United States carriers that fly the MAX, American, United, and Southwest, had already pushed back MAX flights until June. Boeing prepared an estimate of the MAX's approval for its own financial planning in advance of the company's report on quarterly earnings next week, said Gordon Londrow, a company spokesperson. This company says it will fix your smile. It may shush you if it doesn't. Smile Direct Club, founded in Nashville in 2014 by a pair of childhood friends, Alex Fenkel and Jordan Katzman, is one of the largest of the new online health companies that sell directly to consumers. To obtain Smile Direct Club's teeth aligners, people make a mold of their teeth at home with a kit provided by the company or visit one of the more than 300 Smile Shop retail locations to have their mouth and teeth scanned. Smile Direct Club has more than 750,000 customers, according to customer filings. The trade war, paused for now, still wreaking damage. 2 years of tit-for-tat tariffs and on-again, off-again trade talks have left American farmers reeling. In recent months, there have been signs that the damage is spreading. Railroad and truck companies have been cutting jobs, and consumers, at least in part of the country most affected by the trade disputes, may be pulling back as well. The spillover effects are clearest for the transportation sector, where business slowed for railroads and trucking companies as trade slumped last year. France and U.S. moved towards temporary truce in trade war. The apparent detente emerged after Mr. Macron and President Trump agreed in a phone call late Sunday to grant more time for regulations over a global solution to taxing Amazon, Facebook, and other digital companies. Mr. Trump, who is at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, said on Tuesday that he and Mr. Macron had a good conversation, that the United States is very happy with the results. We appreciate very much what President Macron did, Mr. Trump said, though he declined to elaborate on what the two leaders had agreed on. Mr. Trump insisted that only the United States could tax American-based companies and threatened to retaliate with American tariffs of up to 100% on French wine, cheese, handbags, and more. British plans vast privacy protections for children. The British children's protections far outstrip narrower rules in the United States, which apply only to online services aimed at children under 13. The code is a set of principles and standards that require companies to think about, to focus on, and to be accountable for the way they are serving children. The tech industry lobbied Ms. Denham to weaken the rules, arguing that they were too onerous, vague, and broad. In particular, some industry experts said that the code would cause online services to collect even more personal data in order to distinguish their child users and treat them differently. We're going to see the spread of significant data protection laws for children in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Africa, said Baroness Beban Kidron, a children's digital rights advocate who is a member of the House of Lords. Analysis ties hacking of Bezos' phone to a Saudi leader's account. According to the report, Mr. Bezos received a message from the Crown Prince's account in late 2018 that suggested that the prince had intimate knowledge of Mr. Bezos' private life. We call for an investigation on these claims so we can have all the facts out. Mr. Bezos' security consultant, Gavin De Becker, had previously accused the Saudi government of hacking Mr. Bezos' phone, saying the Saudi authorities targeted him because he owned the Washington Post. The report did not say whether Mr. Bezos opened the video attachment, which had an image of Saudi and Swedish flags overlaid with text. A decade later, Dutch officials published a study critical of Boeing. After a Boeing 737 crash near Amsterdam more than a decade ago, an expert study that sharply criticized the manufacturer was never published by the Dutch safety authorities, and its key findings were either excluded or played down in their accident report. The Boeing decides independently on the outcome of its investigations, the content of its reports, and its conclusions and recommendations. A Boeing spokesperson referred questions to the National Transportation Safety Board, which led the American team that commented on the Dutch draft report. The Federal Aviation Administration, which is also a member of the American team participating in the 2009 inquiry, said in a statement that it was following a thorough process for returning the Boeing 737 MAX to passenger service. The agency added that it was working with international safety regulators to review proposed changes to the aircraft, as well as recommendations from safety experts who have examined our certification process. The Dutch board's final report, released in 2010, focused blame on numerous mistakes by the pilots, including their failure to notice a dangerous drop in speed and their incorrect response to an alert warning of an impending stall. A late push to find wildfire victims doubles PG&E's claims. In his report, a court-appointed accountant charged with identifying and finding additional wildfire victims attributed the increased number of claims to, among other things, grassroots campaign efforts of the fire victims themselves. Less than 3 weeks before the previous October 31st deadline, the New York Times reported that about 31,500 victims had filed claims, but more than 70,000 others could lose out on benefits if they did not act quickly. Judge James Donato of the United States District Court, who is responsible for estimating how much PG&E owes wildfire victims, said it would be a heartbreaking shame if even 10% of the eligible victims don't file claims for whatever reason. If we're talking about 50% not filing, that's intolerable. Judge Donato suggested that someone should be going door to door to get victims to file claims. Steve Skikos, a court-appointed lawyer representing victims' interests, said fire victims had met and decided to help ensure that others were included in the compensation pool. Detroit revival is anchored in its train stations. Michigan Central Station has long been a symbol of Detroit's vibrancy, and then it became an international symbol of decline, said Detroit's Mayor Mike Dugan. Ford's transformation of Michigan General Station is a part of the bigger resurgence of Detroit, a story mirrored in cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland that are trying to reinvent themselves to attract new jobs and residents. The transformation of the train station has helped attract other investment throughout Detroit, Mr. Dugan said. Ford has created momentum for other mega projects. In February, Fiat Chrysler announced a $4.5 billion investment in 5 Michigan plants, creating about 6,500 jobs. And that is Reading the Times for Wednesday, January 22nd, 2020. Reading the Times for Wednesday, January 22nd, 2020.